In this discussion, we are going to talk about the manner in which English education acted as a kind of an instrument of a more ambitious scheme of westernization of India. When we were discussing Orientalism or the British attitudes towards India, we had suggested that civilizing mission was one of the very important motives in British imperial ideology. And you can very well see how English education, which became popular among Indians, among elite Indians, of course, and which began to be pursued by the British more consistently from 1830s onwards, was very consciously designed by the English not merely as an instrument of domination but also as a method of dissemination of Western culture in Indian society, exposing Indians to modern ideas, scientific ideas, rational ideas. Of course, there is an assumption that nothing of these changes could be anticipated from within the Indian tradition, but this arrogance was quite integral to the whole notion of civilizing mission. The point that requires to be probed more elaborately, more deeply, is the nature of the Indian engagement with it, Indian response to the way the British were seeking to recast India and, in some cases, even to create a new West in India. What was the nature of this, what may be labeled as creative engagement?
Sir, what was the nature of this creative engagement?
Yes, that is the basically the question that I was trying to raise. That if you look at the Indian society, this particular dimension always remains important in any discussion on the educational policy of the British. If you look at the Indian people, the elite Indians who took up English education more enthusiastically than others, you could see clearly three different strands. One was, which may be labeled as a more utilitarian approach, where English education was sought, but always with the caveat that this was pursued only for professional reasons. You have a clear divide between the inner world, where the Indians were expected to maintain the sanctity of their culture, and the public world, the outer world, where engaging with the imperialism became necessary for professional reasons, for reasons of pursuit of career, for reasons of livelihood. So, this is one line of approach, that you are not going to change much except that you learn the language in order to make a career. There was the other extreme of completely ignoring the Indian tradition and to become so enamored by the West that you allow yourselves to be carried away entirely by Western ideas. There is also an element of extremist, a kind of blindness in this kind of an approach. There is a third approach, which I call the creative engagement with the West, which is that you make an effort to reassess your tradition, make an effort to assess what you can perhaps contribute to this dialogue that you are actually carrying on with the West. You are observing Western ideas, and on the strength of the new ideas that you acquire from your exposure to Western education, you begin to make an assessment of your own culture, your own history, without discarding the West entirely, but trying to blend the new knowledge that you have acquired with your own tradition. Now, this creative engagement could be seen in many spheres, in history writing, in pursuit of sciences, in attempts by people like Ram Mohan Rai and his followers in the Brahmo movement to recast Indian religious system in the light of the lessons that they had derived from their knowledge of Christianity. So, when we talk about the educational policy of the British and try to measure the impact of this educational policy in terms of the responses that it had evoked from the Indian society, I'm not talking about the people at large, I'm talking about people who are capable of engaging with the West in this manner. You see a creative engagement. archaeological tools you learn from the British, but then you use your archaeological tools to present the great Indian heritage. You learn new historical methods to write the history of your own country using your own resources. You learn modern science from the West, but at the same time, after a while, you try to project a sort of nationalist science that historians are now talking about. So that is where the education that the British imparted with certain objectives led to various other kinds of developments. You create fields of knowledge which began to be used by the nationalists for projecting the sanctity of the nation. Before we come to this creative engagement, one has to talk about the contribution that English education made to this process of cultural change. It is common knowledge that English education was a catalyst to this process. And you also are familiar with the objectives behind the spread of English education, behind the policy to disseminate English education. If we take Macaulay as one of the great protagonists of English education in the sense of teaching new knowledge in the English language, you see the limitation also in what Macaulay described as the filtration theory or the percolation theory.
Sir, what was the filtration or percolation theory all about?
The basic assumption of filtration theory is, in the way Macaulay understood it, or even before Macaulay, there were others who suggested same policies, same strategies, is that you choose a handful of Indians recruited from fairly wealthy and established communities, from the elites, so to say. You expose them to English education, and these elites in turn would actually disseminate the knowledge that they would acquire from the institutions of learning into the larger society. So, percolation theory would assume that English education, in the sense of imparting Western knowledge through English language, was good enough for the elites of the society, for the latter in turn to translate these ideas and practices and knowledge into the vernacular, for the new knowledge to percolate downwards to the larger society. That is the basic idea behind the percolation thesis. But what this percolation thesis misses out, I mean, it's of course there is a connection, that at the same time the British needed some people trained in the English language to act as their managers, act as their assistants in the administration of the country. The exposure to modern science came, or modern kinds of knowledge came as a kind of a consequence, not always intended, of English education. If you look at the initial moment when this new educational policy was promulgated by men like Macaulay, and before Macaulay you have personalities like Charles Grant suggesting the same thing, you see the intention clearly that you have to create a class of Indians who would act as go-betweens, but at the same time who would be in a position to disseminate the knowledge that they would acquire to the larger society. What needs to be borne in mind, and on this you have extensive literature produced by scholars like David Cobb, for example, British Orientalism and the Bengal Renaissance Style, a kind of book, that before this particular stand was taken by the British, there were several other attempts as well. One of these attempts was to put great stress on classical education, exposing Britons to the rich cultural heritage of ancient India, the cultural heritage of medieval India, asking them to learn Sanskrit and Persian in institutions like Fort William College, which existed briefly. But during its brief existence, Fort William College became an important center of education or important center of production of knowledge, to which the British officials were exposed. Alongside this classicism, which is basically the thrust of Orientalism, which started under Hastings, but which led to the development of institutions like Asiatic Society in 1784, establishment of Sanskrit College in Benares by Jonathan Duncan. You have School Book Society, which came a bit later, but the idea was to translate books into vernacular language and circulate them more among students. There was another emphasis alongside this classicism, was to cater modern knowledge, that is Western knowledge, science, new philosophy, to the Indian student community, to the Indian readership, through vernacular medium. And before the Minute on Education was actually accepted by the government, the same Governor General William Bentinck had asked William Adam to conduct an inquiry into the nature of the vernacular education and the kind of institutions that existed at that time in that area, in that field. So Adams' idea was that the best method of imparting education to the larger body of people was to strengthen these local vernacular institutions where a different kind of tradition already existed. So Adam was very anxious to use the existing local institutions of education to impart this new knowledge through these institutions to a larger body of people. It was somewhat different from the kind of approach that you see in a person, for example, like H. Wilson. H. Wilson, who actually got into a debate with the Anglicist over the question of how the money that had been allocated by the Charter Act of 1813 for purposes of education, how that money was going to be spent. You know that 1813, a paltry amount of 1 lakh was apportioned by the government, by the colonial government, to be spent on education, and around that a controversy began to erupt from the 1820s onwards, and that is precisely what is described as the Anglicist Orientalist controversy. On one side you have the classicists like H. Wilson, who were interested in classical language of the kind that Fort William College had taught to the British official students of theirs. Wilson was very anxious to establish the Sanskrit College, which it did in 1824, and apportionment of the large amount of the larger percentage of this fund to promotion of Sanskrit education. On the other side, you have men like Charles Grant, for example. Charles Grant, from an earlier time, had been campaigning in favor of Western education with a certain kind of missionary zeal. Charles Grant's idea was to introduce evangelical Christianity into India in order to make Indian society dynamic and rational. And with that kind of a purpose, or with that intention, several missionary institutions had also started growing from the early part of the 19th century. The idea was to create a basis of Western knowledge in order to attract people to Christianity. So a debate had been going on for some time about what should be the ideal system of education for India, and this debate became much more topical and relevant once a certain amount of money came to be apportioned for purposes of education. So you have the case of Ram Mohan Rai writing his famous memorial to Amherst in 1823 that it was pointless to spend so much money in Sanskrit education, which the Orientalists were actually campaigning for. It was important for the English to recognize the fact that only through English education, only through Western education, familiarity with English language and literature, the Indians should be able to make profitable use of their knowledge. So there is an element of utilitarianism in Ram Mohan's conception of how education in English language would be more useful to people aspiring for a career under the imperial system.
Excuse me, sir, what was the long-term impact of this emphasis on English education?
That is the point, actually. That is where the percolation theory also becomes relevant. That ultimately, what Adam was suggesting was a much better method of making available Western knowledge through vernacular medium, strengthening the institutions that had already existed. But the way Macaulay had projected it created a long-term divide in the educational system, where you have a handful of institutions, mainly in the main metropolitan centers, which provided education to the small elites. And on the other side, you have this indigenous education, which began to languish. So, such institutions needed some amount of protection and patronage on the part of the government, which was Adam's intention. And Adam had made it explicit in the second report he submitted to Bentinck. And then, by the time he submitted the third report in 1838, the policy had already been decided. Following Macaulay's Bennett, the government has decided that whatever funding or whatever patronage that the government was to extend to education institutions should go to institutions imparting modern education in English language. That is where Macaulay's percolation theory won over Adam's thesis of Adam's argument of a different nature, different vision of education altogether. But coming to the point that you were raising, that apart from the divide that it creates in the educational system between a languishing indigenous system and an Western system which was limited within the urban areas and was incapable because of limited government patronage to extend into larger areas. Apart from that, you see other limitations as well. The emphasis on a certain kind of curriculum. The emphasis was mainly on, say, for example, teaching language, teaching literature, humanist education, emphasis on liberal arts, but maybe religion. But what about science? What about technology? That remains an important problem with the new education that the British introduced. Scientific education was not what was intended. Gauri Viswanathan, a scholar of great reputation, has written recently a book called Masks of Conquest, in which she has made an assessment of what was the long-term objective of Macaulay's policy. Somebody would actually go to the extent of describing this as Macaulay's poison tree. That idea was to preach loyalism among the people. But ultimately, this, of course, didn't succeed. Where the creative engagement argument of mine, which I set out in the early part of the discussion, becomes relevant, that Indians learned many things from the British, the new philosophy from the British, the new political ideas from the British, and used these ideas against the British at the time when nationalism started making its emergence. So it is possible for us to look for a certain kind of hybridity in the way the nationalists began to make use of this new learning in order to strengthen their position against the British. Political ideology, of course, is the most convenient sphere where we can see the challenge, but we can see it in other spheres as well, in different discursive fields, in different fields of knowledge as well, something which I was mentioning in the early part. The third important limitation concerns the limitation of numbers of people who could be brought within this network of modern education. It is in this context another important intervention by the British acquires significance, which is the famous Charles Wood's Dispatch of 1854, in which Charles Wood, in the first place, reiterated the filtration theory as the only possible convenient method for Indian society to become exposed to this new kind of education. And secondly, Charles Wood emphasized the point that instead of government actually directly promoting institutions of education, barring a few major centers, it was important to resort to a grant-in-aid system in order to encourage private initiatives in the field of education. So the grant-in-aid system actually visualized the creation of a large network of private institutions established by the Indian notables in the small towns, receiving grants and creating or serving the same purpose as Macaulay had visualized. So if you come to the period after 1857 and see the massive expansion of higher education that was taking place in Bengal at that time, but also to some extent in other provinces as well, you see the impact of the Charles Wood system or the grant-in-aid system. Private individuals, notables, jamidars, landowning classes, they were actually moving towards a new kind of cultural patronage in establishing schools and colleges, institutions, which would actually cater this modern education to the local communities. And 1857 was the year when the famous Hindu college that had been set up in 1818 as an institution which was expected, in keeping with the spirit of the time, to disseminate Western knowledge through vernacular language. His Hindu college was turned into Presidency College. But in the meanwhile, as you know, in the history of the Hindu college, changes had already taken place. The Hindu college had adopted the scheme that Macaulay had outlined, had created a major cultural movement in the form of the Young Bengal, and then it merged into the 19th century cultural efflorescence that one saw in Bengal in the 19th century. You have similar other institutions set up in other places as well. So roughly around the 1850s, after the revolt, when the universities were set up and presidency colleges were set up in the three presidency towns, there were other institutions which came up. Elphinstone College in Bombay, Madras Christian College, then you have Ferguson College at Pune, which set up by prominent Indians, but not even receiving grant from the government at all. You see a massive expansion of higher education of this kind through private initiatives in the later half of the 19th century. This is one sphere where you see promotion of educational institutions by private individuals. But one has to consider also the role of many societies. Asiatic Society is one of the early examples. 1784, of a time when the British were still devoted to learning of classical knowledge, classical culture in India. The Nehruians set up the famous Society for the Acquisition of General Knowledge, synchronizing with the establishment of Tattvabodhini Sabha by the early Brahmas. Akhay Datta and others, when they set up some scientific societies, their main emphasis was on translating modern science into vernacular or circulating them as extensively as possible in the province. So there were initiatives among Indians to set up institutions and societies which should be able to cater scientific knowledge to the people. Scientific knowledge which would be of great use for India. And it is in this sphere we also see the limitation of Macaulay's education. And this limitation would become far more glaring as the century draws towards its close. You create a large community of English educated people who could not be absorbed as professionals, who could not be offered jobs. The problem of educated unemployment began to crop up. Extreme emphasis on English language was leading to the atrophy of cultivation of indigenous knowledge. So there can be many ways through which you can approach this problem, but one of the central questions concerns the kind of limitation that was integral to Indian society under colonial conditions, for which reason the education had to be what Macaulay was actually seeking to introduce. India was not an industrialized country. Industries were not also expected to develop because of a certain kind of domination of European capital in the economy. And given the fact that India was not going to develop industrially, there was no likelihood of any great demand for scientific or technological know-how. The limitation that this education system created on the development of scientific education would become very clear as we come to the end of the 19th century. How many medical colleges? Very few medical colleges. Most of these colleges, if you go through the University Commission's reports of the turn of the century, early 20th century, you see how large number of colleges were set up for liberal education. Medical institutions were few and far between. Technological institutions imparting technological knowledge were very small in number, largely because of the lack of need from within the Indian economy for this kind of know-how. So ultimately, if we are to make an assessment of the new education, we have to return to the point with which we had started, this aspect of creative engagement, the manner in which the Indians were trying to create new fields of inquiry, for them to become aware of the new streams of knowledge, not merely limiting themselves to studying British history or Roman history or the glory of European imperialism or simply English language. They were also drawn into new fields of inquiry for purposes which were actually looking forward to India's progress as a modern nation. So this is in this context, some historians like Deepak Kumar, for example, writes about nationalist science, writes about the many obstacles that teachers like Jagadish Chandra Bose were facing in the teaching of science in the colleges and in the institutions. The nationalist science produced Prafulla Chandra Rai, who also wanted to make use of scientific knowledge for purposes of entrepreneurship, but that is a later story, different story. But if you go through the famous work of Prafulla Chandra Rai called History of Hindu Chemistry, you see how Prafulla Chandra Rai was looking for the knowledge of chemistry in some of the ancient practices of India. So the knowledge of new science was enabling people like Jagadish Chandra Bose to carve out a niche in what he described as the universal empire of science in which Indians ought to get a place, or to Prafulla Chandra Rai, who was participating in the same process of creative engagement and trying to look for science in ancient India in practices which he tried to make an assessment of on the strength of his knowledge of modern chemistry. So you recognize the limitations, but at the same time, you see how new possibilities were emerging at the close of the 19th century within a system of education which concentrated on certain limited spheres, but which ultimately allowed Indians to show the appropriate initiative towards the creation of new fields of inquiry.